That's the problem.
That's the Georgetown way.
Thought there was a cow on the tracks.
It was ridiculous.
No, seriously? I thought there was a cow.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, something. I don't know.
Hello.
I'm making that up. I'm making that up.
There was
Okay.
something.
Hang on, our
Tomas,
panelists
how are
are
you?
chatting. Hello, everybody. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. I am also the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host organization for today. I am very excited to say that we're having a discussion today for the next hour and a half or so about U.S. antitrust policy, populism, economics, or politics. It promises to be, I think, a very robust discussion, partly because we have a superb panel. Indeed, the panel, I think, is so superb and so outstanding that we decided we needed two moderators, not just one, to channel their expertise and energy. So I will be one of the panelists or the moderators, and my colleague Mark Whitener, who is on my far left, will be the other moderator. Mark is an adjunct professor of antitrust in the McDonough School. He is also a senior policy fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Before coming to Georgetown, Mark was the general counsel for competition law and policy at General Electric, which you know had lots of antitrust activities, whether they wanted them or not, over many years. And before that, Mark was in enforcement at the Federal Trade Commission as the deputy director of the Bureau of Competition. So we're thrilled to have Mark here. I want to turn it over to Mark, but let me just say a couple things about logistics just for the moment. And that is that we're going to have, let's call it 45 minutes or so of panel discussion with moderators and the panelists. And then we will turn it over to a period of formal Q&A from the audience. One of the really nice things about being in Washington these days is that there are experts all over the place. And in this instance, when I looked at the list of people that are here today, there are many experts in antitrust that are present that very well could be on the dais instead of in the audience. So we're really looking forward to your questions during that period. The only thing I would ask is that if you're going to ask a question, that you please wait until a microphone comes around to you so that you can identify yourself and your organization, and we'll keep this recorded for posterity's sake. It's being live streamed and recorded, so that just helps for the future of the presentation. So with that said, let me turn it over to Mark, who will then in turn introduce the panelists and kick it off.
Okay, thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. So here we are. We're 9 months into the Trump administration. Does it seem a little longer than that to anybody? The new antitrust leaders have been in place for 6 or 7 months. Not very long, but I think it's long enough for us to have a discussion. I think it's a very good time to have a discussion partly about what we've seen in the first few months and also looking forward to the next 3 or so years. To set the stage for the discussion before I introduce the panelists, I think it's helpful to bear in mind that while we're at the beginning, really, of Trump antitrust, we are several years into a very deep antitrust discussion that started probably before the Biden administration, but certainly accelerated during the Biden administration. The so-called neo-Brandeisian antitrust leaders really tried to undertake a fundamental reform of antitrust policy in a more aggressive and some would say more populist direction. Before that time, fluctuations in antitrust policy really tended to be fairly narrow. And that reflected a rough bipartisan consensus that antitrust should focus on economic analysis and consumer welfare. So while we're in the early days of Trump antitrust, we are deeply into this antitrust discussion. What are we seeing and what will we see over the next few years? Will we see the Trump administration steer sharply away from the policies of its predecessors? Will we see the adoption of some of those policies? Will we see a move back to the pre-neo-Brandeisian sort of rough consensus, or something else altogether? To help us address those questions, we have an expert panel. All of our panelists are leading antitrust experts with a long list of accomplishments. I'll just give you a few highlights so you know what you're getting into here. Deb Garza is vice chair of the law firm Rule Garza Howley, got her JD from University of Chicago, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and Acting Assistant Attorney General leading the Antitrust Division at Justice. She chaired the Antitrust Modernization Commission, a congressionally created look at antitrust. She chaired the antitrust section of the ABA, and she's received many awards, including GCR's Lifetime Achievement Award. Howard Shalansky is a Joseph and Madeline Sheehy Chair in Antitrust Law at Georgetown Law Center. He's also a member of the Davis Polk and Wardwell Law Firm. Got his JD and his PhD in economics from Berkeley, clerked for several judges, including Justice Scalia, served as the director of the Bureau of Economics at the FTC, and also, worth noting, in the Obama administration, he headed the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, which has been called the most powerful agency you've never heard of, though this being a DC crowd, I suspect most of you have heard of it. Finally, last but not least, Larry White is the Robert Cavish Professor of Economics at NYU's Stern School of Business. Received his BA and PhD in economics from Harvard and an MS from the London School of Economics. Larry served as Director of Economic Policy at DOJ's Antitrust Division. He has published many articles and books on antitrust and other economic topics, and among other appointments and honors, Larry is the General Editor of the Review of Industrial Organization. Okay, with that, I want to start the discussion by asking each of our panelists in turn to tell us, first in a word or phrase, if they can, and then they get to explain, how would you describe Trump antitrust, looking at what has happened so far and or what you expect in the future? So let's start, each of you, with your word or phrase and then a bit more of an explanation. And Deb, why don't you kick us off?
Okay. So my one word is consequential. If you had initially allowed us 2 words, I would have said potentially consequential. And I'll just to give a little context, which will align with your introduction. Over the last 40 years, I thought that the Reagan administration was consequential. Consequential for a lot of reasons. The breakup of AT&T, which Larry was quite involved in, that a lot of people think was important to releasing innovation and leading to a bit of what we see today. Also important for the discussion about antitrust versus regulation. There were the 1982 merger guidelines, which actually is also part of Larry's. So really and it was based on economics and thinking that was brewing, but it really changed the way that merger control operated. The consumer welfare standard was adopted. I think that was very important. The emphasis on economics and making enforcement decisions. And that really, all those developments really over the course of time changed the discussion of antitrust, I think, and influenced the case law, which we're dealing with today, and was very influential, I think, ex-US. And so I think that was consequential. The Biden administration, and as Mark said, it kind of grew and continued with a lot of, I think, bipartisan support as it developed. And the Biden administration they intended to be consequential, clearly. They disagreed they wanted to turn back the clock to the pre-Reagan era. They didn't like the consumer welfare standard. They were, some would say, hostile to M&A, which they expressed through their rhetoric, through the 2023 merger guidelines, through their stance that they wouldn't accept remedies for mergers, and they explored using AT&T antitrust as a tool for social engineering. And of course, the Section 2 cases against Meta, Amazon, Apple, Google, which are, I think, are probably going to be consequential. So short term, I think that the Biden administration was consequential. We'll discuss, I think, whether longer term it will be. And that's an open question. So there are 5 ways in which I think that the Trump administration could be consequential. One is how it resolves those monopoly cases against Meta, Amazon, Apple, Google, and I'll throw in Ticketmaster, Live Nation. Of course, one of the Google cases the search case was actually brought in Trump 1. So there are 2 Google cases, one involving ad tech and one with search. So obviously, how those cases are resolved will have effects on the companies, but they will have effects in industries, maybe as much as in like AT&T. And those are also important because it tells us about what the Trump administration's approach will be to non-horizontal mergers and mergers generally. Second, how the administration chooses to handle specific deals, because I think that we're likely to see deals, important deals, challenging deals in transforming industries. One, for example, broadcast television, cable, media, those are all going to be consequential to how we get content and diversity of viewpoints, et cetera. So I think that will be AI, how they choose to handle AI, which is just at the beginning. Gail Slater has said she expects the desire for companies to control high quality and high volume data to fuel a lot of M&A. Both she and I believe Andrew Ferguson and maybe Mark Mader and others have expressed concerns that they thought that the agencies made mistakes back at the time when we were seeing the dawn of the internet with how they addressed or didn't address certain conduct of some of the tech companies, and Google, for example. So they seemed really bound and determined to make sure that they don't repeat mistakes, and they're going to have some, it'll depend on whether they choose to intervene now or not, but how they act with respect to AI and matters involving AI, I think may be consequential. Data in general, how they react to mergers involving a lot of data. And then Gail Slater said all industries are data industries. Third, whether the administration follows more of a Trump 1 path or chooses the more populist approach. There's some indication, I mean, Mader has talked about a populist approach, and Slater at her Notre Dame speech, by which I mean kind of a big is bad, small is good sort of thing. Will they convert what was, I think, an anomaly in the Biden administration by using that kind of populist approach to something that's more lasting? I can't myself, I believe not. I think they're going to go more to sort of a more traditional approach, but we'll see. Fourth, Humphrey's executor. Will we have a 2-agency approach, or will we go to a 1-agency approach? And then rule of law issues, I think, are important. Our economy has, I think, benefited from transparent, objective enforcement. We've evangelized that around the world for years. I don't really think I've seen a big departure, but it's something to watch, and perceptions do matter. And so that's another way in which it could be consequential. I hope that we'll retain the rule of law and antitrust, but it will certainly be consequential if we don't. That's it.
Okay, great. Howard, you want to go next?
Great, thanks, Mark, and it's a real pleasure to be here and always an honor to share the podium with 2 people I admire a lot in Deb and Larry. So thank you so much for including me today. I think the way I would characterize Trump antitrust is walking a little bit of I don't want to say a tightrope, but walking a line. I think there's a desire on the part of the Trump administration to differentiate themselves from the Biden administration, not in thinking that antitrust should be strongly enforced or in something of a populist approach, but in what they, I think, perceived as some of the procedural abuses and overreach of that era. So how do you pull back on that at the same time that you maintain strong enforcement? I think that's a little bit of the balance that we're seeing. So what I would expect to see in Trump antitrust, and what I think we are starting to see, is a much more pragmatic approach to process. Chair Ferguson has stated clearly, in fact here at Georgetown, that they will investigate hard, but when they see that they're not going to have a case, they'll get out of the way. And I think we've started to see that in some transactions. I think that they are also making every effort to be a little bit more transparent and a little bit more efficient in how they are investigating matters. So I think that's how they're trying to pull back on some of the things that happened in the Biden administration. Another dimension on which I think we're seeing increased pragmatism is in remedies. Both the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have shown themselves to be open for business and negotiation when it comes to remedies, still with a heavy focus on structural remedies, which goes back to Assistant Attorney General Del Rahim in the first Trump administration, but even before then. Where we're seeing some continuity, though, is, maintenance of the 2023 guidelines, even if enforced a little more selectively or a little more pragmatically. Retention of the new HSR regulations, which, may have been long needed. And we're not, we're seeing those enforced in, I think, a reasonably practical way. But then really intense investigation of certain industries that are of particular pocketbook interest, particular interest to everyday consumers. You will hear both Assistant Attorney General Slater and Chair Ferguson talk about the need to make sure that average consumers are not at the mercy of market power in industries such as household goods, healthcare, energy. And so in those kinds of areas, we're actually seeing enforcement and scrutiny, I would say, that's every bit as stringent as what we saw in the Biden administration. So there's a little bit of a selection bias in terms of where they are maintaining that strict scrutiny. But that, again, is part of their effort to maintain or to walk a line between shifting more towards a pragmatic, regular order approach, but retaining some of the populist enforcement strength that really rose, although, as Mark mentioned, had antecedents before the Biden administration, but really arose in the Biden administration. Just on big tech, I don't see much of a change. We may see a shift in how the agency chooses to resolve some of these cases at the end of the day after a remedies phase. But despite efforts of the parties to get the new Trump administration to withdraw some of the cases that had been brought, in some cases, not just the Google search case, but the case against then Facebook, now Meta, were brought in the first Trump administration. We've seen no deviation from the course from the agencies and the energy that they're putting into those big tech cases. So we'll have to wait and see what they do on remedies.
Okay. Larry.
Well, like my fellow panelists, I'm really pleased to be here. Had to get up really early to get a train to come down, but I'm really pleased to be here. My one word would be idiosyncratic, and I'll modify that a little bit. It's still early days. It may be 9 months in, but it's still early days. I'm going to be echoing some of the things that both Deb and Howard have mentioned, but if you think about the Trump administration overall, there is a populist streak to it. There's populism in the Biden administration, there's populism in the Trump administration. Clearly, there are multiple versions of populism. There's the traditional pro-business attitude of a Republican administration, except when it comes to tech firms, where not so much. There has traditionally been, in the antitrust area, a greater emphasis on economic analysis. But, you look back at, say, the Clinton administration and the antitrust efforts, both at the division and at the Federal Trade Commission, involved economists extensively. And quite honestly, one of the disappointments in the economic sphere so far is we are, I don't know how many months into Chairman Ferguson's reign at the Federal Trade Commission. 6 months or so?
6 or 7.
6 or 7, and they have yet to appoint a chief economist, a director of the Bureau of Economics. There's still an acting director. He's a perfectly good guy, but it's not the same as having and that's not even a position that needs Senate confirmation. That's just an appointment by the chair, and it hasn't happened. So you wonder. If you think about what are the 3 major strains of antitrust policy, and enforcement. It is price fixing cartels, it is merger policy, and it is monopolization in its various manifestations. I think in terms of price fixing cartel behavior, that's been a nonpartisan, Democrats, Republicans, nobody likes price fixing. The interesting area is going to be where AI algorithms come in, and you've got what might be characterized as a central focal, a hub and spokes type of arrangement. There are existing suits out there right now that justice has brought. It's going to be, and it looks like the Trump administration is going to continue with that. In terms of merger policy, there you're going to see a whole mix of things. A tendency to think things are more competitive. That's the way Republican administrations have, they go through the same analysis, but they see barriers to entry being lower, the ability of firms to coordinate in small number of situations, also lower. But when it comes to tech firms, I think there's going to be a tougher look at things. And again, the strain of populism may intervene. And as we've seen in multiple areas, what the president thinks about these things may have some influence. Finally, monopolization issues, and as both Deb and Howard have mentioned, this administration, the Trump 1 was the administration that brought the initial Google search case and brought the original Facebook Meta case. And they're continuing to pursue those and are pursuing the cases that the Biden administration brought. So we'll see a lot of activity there. At the same time, the FTC clearly is stepping back from its predecessors, saying, hey, those guys, we don't want to be associated with them. Yeah, we are not going to step away from the merger guidelines, but non-compete clauses, they've dropped that rule-making effort. And I think there was just a speech recently by one of the board members at the commissioners at the FTC. We're not going to be leaning on international agency, other countries' antitrust enforcers to do stuff that we wish we could have done but didn't. So it's going to be a mixed bag. It's early days. I think we're going to learn a lot by what happens. A week ago, I would have said the Paramount Warner Brothers, the Paramount Warner Brothers proposed merger. That looks like a non-starter, but this morning's news says Warner still wants to make a deal with somebody. How that gets resolved, I think, is going to tell us a lot about the various strains of antitrust policy.
Great. Okay, so if I pull it all together, the agencies are consequentially walking a line in an idiosyncratic manner. So, no, but that's all. There's a lot in what everybody just said, and I have some questions that I wanted to go through, and you've helped me streamline this a little bit. So, with your indulgence, I was going to ask you all to start digging in on contrasting the current administration with its predecessors. You've all made a lot of points there. So I'm going to skip over that to basically address the issues I was going to ask about in the next two questions, focusing on big tech, the monopolization cases, and merger policy, because I really want to get to both of those things. So if we could focus on big tech for a second. You've all made the point the current administration has maintained, continued the cases that were brought by either the Biden administration or some of them by Trump 1. And the courts are now starting to have their voice heard, most notably in the Google search case, where we now have a decision from the district court on the merits and on remedies. So if I could ask Howard to go first on this one, how do you look at this substantively, both in terms of what the administration is doing and how the courts are starting to react to these cases?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me start by saying that I think that the real line of consistency that one can see over the last, roughly decade is concern about the power that big tech platforms have over various aspects of everyday life. Now, we do need to step back and ask the counterfactual question. What actions could have been taken 15 years ago, 20 years ago that would have been effective or consequential, and that we are confident would have led to a better world had we taken them? I think that's a very hard question, because let's not lose track of the fact that what these companies have done in terms of technological development and investment is remarkable by any measure if you look over the course of US and indeed world economic history. The real dollar values of what have been invested is remarkable. The transformation of technology has been remarkable. What is deeply concerning is the sort of monolithic control over these extremely valuable services. And so I think that is a concern that transforms beyond the the sort of traditionally narrow concerns of antitrust law about price and output. Has to do with information, the quality of information, how our preferences are formed, the effects that these platforms may have on well-being and teen health. There are all kinds of issues that typically fall outside of the broader consumer welfare standard, but that I think people left, right, and center share as a policy concern. So I don't see the tool that is in the hands of the Justice Department Antitrust Division or the FTC, the antitrust tools being laid aside in that broader sort of effort to make sure that big tech platforms don't gain more power over our everyday lives than is necessary, and that they keep the market open to competition. The Nobel Prize in Economics last week went to a number of people who really talked about the value of innovation and dynamic competition for driving economic growth. It was a very worthwhile prize. The lesson for that is not let firms get big and don't care. The lesson is if firms get big and earn their just returns, but don't do things that block the next generation of technologies from displacing them, we have really socially valuable dynamic cycles. I think that is also shared by the agencies. The courts have to deal with the law that's on the books. The courts have to deal with the remedies that they can equitably grant in the context of their antitrust jurisdiction and that tie to the facts of the case. And in that regard, I think the jury's still out. We have only one remedies decision, and that's the remedies decision from Judge Mehta, an extremely capable and thoughtful district judge here in DC, in the Google search case. There is a really interesting thing that you will observe if you carefully read his liability decision and then read his remedies decision. They don't exactly line up. And it is very interesting that he finds a number of things of concern and to contribute to monopolizing conduct in the liability case that he then does not turn around and attach a remedy to at the remedies phase of the trial. And I think that's because he was willing to give a relatively light burden on causation between conduct and harm for liability purposes, but imposed a somewhat higher standard on the Department of Justice when it came to the remedy phase. Before I tell Google, channeling Judge Mehta, that they cannot have default agreements with platforms like Apple, I really need you, the Justice Department, to show me that those were causal and that without those there would have been a different level of market power by Google. He allowed default agreements to be considered as monopolizing conduct and contributing to monopoly power at the liability phase, but then he didn't bar default agreements in the remedies phase. And I think that this is, it's sort of an interesting juxtaposition because it leaves one to wonder, how are we going to avoid having pyrrhic or symbolic liability decisions that actually pay off in effective remedies. In fact, the whole history of remedies in big tech, going back to Microsoft and even before, is really not the best story if you look at what the effects were.
And the same has been true in Europe.
And the same, in fact, even worse to some degree. But I'll keep the discussion focused, channeling Commissioner Holyoke. We don't need to rely on the foreign jurisdictions. Let's talk about what we're doing here. But no, agree. It's been worse in Europe. So I think the judges are stuck with this, equitable task of assigning remedies. With a tough predictive job about what is going to maintain the ability of the company that's been found liable to remain an innovative, fully competing firm, but actually be effective in introducing competition. And I think Judge Mehta, walked the line as best he could in the Google search case. What's going to be really interesting is to see what the appetite is for the antitrust agencies to go back to the court to try to enforce these remedial orders, assuming they're upheld on appeal. And what is going to be the appetite of these agencies to go to the oversight committees that are being formed to monitor these remedies and to blow the whistle on the platforms when they think things are not being done. So we will learn going forward just how strong the enforcement will be. My prediction is that the government, through the Trump administration, will remain vigilant. You can agree or disagree with Chair Ferguson's policies and priorities. You can agree or disagree with, Gail Slater's policies or priorities. But they're serious people, and I think that each of them is actually very serious about doing their job. It may be idiosyncratic, it may be walking a line, it may be consequential or selective, but I think big tech is one area where I think they're really gonna hold the line. And by the way, I think they're gonna lose the Facebook case. I think the FTC's, they're certainly gonna lose half of it. I think they may lose the whole thing. And even if they win on liability, I don't see a remedy. I should disclose, by the way, I gave legal advice to Facebook during not the trial, but during the course of the FTC investigation. But I think that's gonna be a really tough case. It'll be interesting to see if they go to the mat and appeal any losses there. Listening to Commissioner Mitter, I believe they will.
I'm tempted to go down the line and ask how all the other cases are going to come out, but I won't do that. And in the interest of time, I guess I'll ask Deb and then Larry to briefly weigh in on this topic before we turn to mergers.
So I agree with your viewpoint totally. I do think that the Trump administration is very focused on innovation and dynamic competition. And then there's this whole battle of big tech versus little tech. And there's a sensitivity about, little tech being able to, it's a hard choice. And little tech, we want them to survive and grow and prosper and innovate. But on the other hand, there's a recognition that in order to have little tech, you have to have these exit ramps where they can get sold. To me, the looking at the Meta case, the Meta decision, it brings up the really big problem of when do you intervene in these sort of industries? And I remember a time, I can't remember what year it was a long time ago, there was a Chatham House Rules discussion in the Japanese embassy and involved folks from the EU and folks from the DOJ and the FTC, and the discussion was, when is the right time to intervene? How much certainty do we have to have? How do we know we're not doing harm? But what if we wait, and will it be remedial? Will we be able to get remedies? And so I think you're seeing that. I mean, a lot of people obviously argued back, I think, during the Clinton administration that, and I'll have to disclose that I counsel clients on this issue, but there was a point in time when, for example, the Federal Trade Commission might have said, things are moving from the desktop to mobile. We've seen what's happened in desktop. We don't know if we have a remedy that one that we feel comfortable with. Should we set the rules now for mobile? Should we look now at basically what kinds of agreements might be too restrictive and basically be an impediment to innovation? Hard decision to make, but I sometimes wish they had. I advocated that they should, but I also wish as an individual that they had. So now you're in a situation where I think it's just really hard. And Judge Mehta was obviously very reluctant, and I think he was dealing with the law and the need to connect causation to the remedy, but really hard to remedy at this point in time. So that's, I think, and that's why I mentioned potential consequential decisions with AI, I mean, they've got to make that decision. How much do we intervene at this early point? And that, I think, is going to be consequential.
Larry.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Deb just said. Let me rephrase this. You know, the danger of intervening too early is, gee, you don't really know how things are going to play out. The danger of waiting too long is the structure is now baked, and as Deb said, the remedies turn out to be difficult. So that's been a tension going on for at least 30 years. Right, back to the Clinton administration, if not earlier. You know, going back to the Meta case that the FTC has brought, you know, one of their claims is that the acquisition of WhatsApp was a major force. WhatsApp, had it remained independent, could have provided more competition for Meta. But in 2012, I think it was, when you know, there were like a dozen employees at WhatsApp. If the FTC had gone in front of a district court judge here in DC and said, we want a preliminary injunction to prevent Facebook from acquiring this small firm, the judge first would have said, Facebook? Gee, I think I've heard of that. My kids are on Facebook, but you know, it would have been really hard to get a district court judge to issue a preliminary injunction. Remember, I'm not a lawyer. I don't practice law without a license. I'm a mere economist, but I think it would have been hard. One further thing about the Google search decision on first liability, and I believe that liability decision can serve as the basis for follow-on private civil suits where, gee, there's been a finding at the district court level that these guys were guilty. That makes it easier for follow-on plaintiffs to bring their case. The other thing is, I was quite disappointed in Judge Mehta's remedies decision. One thing that could have been done, you know, breaking up the company, you know, AT&T in 1982, 83, 84, maybe the last time anything like that happens. But there was a simple structural remedy that somehow didn't make it to the front of Judge Mehta's head. As of, October 22, 2025, there will be a data dump by Google. Everything they've accumulated, the argument was that the other smaller search engines had been deprived of the data that they could have had because they were shut out because of the default arrangements. All right, here's the data. It's available one time only to anybody who can say make a reasonable argument they are a search engine. Going forward, though, there's no expectation of any data sharing. That arguably could have made up for the harm that the competitors had suffered. I was really disappointed that Judge Mehta didn't go in that direction.
Okay, great. So I want to try to get to a few more questions, so I'm going to ask everybody to try to be succinct, although you can have more than one word or phrase if you like. So let's turn to merger policy, which has been alluded to so far. We're seeing an uptick, I think, in merger activity. We're seeing a lot of deals talked about. Maybe people are starting to anticipate the policies they think they'll be looking at. Deb, maybe you could lead us off. As you look at the tea leaves and actions so far, What are you seeing in merger enforcement? What do you expect?
Okay.
And may I just ask that, Howard, you spoke about remedies sort of getting off the mat in the Trump administration. Might each of you also address the sort of emergent role of efficiencies as a defense in merger cases, if you would, and how you anticipate those coming along?
Well, I think I can be brief in some sense because we've touched on a lot of this stuff. What I was going to say is that structural remedies, willingness to engage in structural remedies, I would recommend to everyone Ferguson's statement in the synopsis and his case, where he, I think, does a very good job of expressing why the Federal Trade Commission is more open to engaging in structural remedies for mergers. I think it's a well-reasoned statement. And it does also continue to emphasize the concerns that the agencies have had for the last many decades about what makes a good structural remedy, right? So all those things are there. Early termination is back. That's good. There basically were none during the Biden administration, at least prior to the shutdown ETs were happening. I think that's a good thing. No express bias against PE firms. That's probably a good thing, although there have been cases that happen to have involved PE firms that just wasn't center in the decisions. The GTCR, Surmatics, the Welsh-Carson settlement, the KKR, DOJ, HSR violations. So PE is not getting away with anything, but we're not biasing enforcement against PE. I agree with everybody. There's no necessarily any change. Real relaxation, innovation competition is alive and well in these cases. It was noted in the synopsis Anna's case. If you look at the Edwards Life Science Gen Valve technology case, that involved the acquisition of two companies around the same time that both had in the pipeline some sort of heart valve devices. They're both just in the pipeline, so it's potential, but it shows that they really are, I think, focusing on innovation effects. I also think that you can't look at the Section 2 cases and not think that there will be vertical cases, non-horizontal cases brought in this administration. A lot of people said, oh, the Biden administration bringing these novel vertical cases. We're going to, I think, in some cases, continue to see non-horizontal challenges brought. I haven't thought about the efficiencies question, but I think we've seen both AAG Slater and Chair Ferguson make statements related to efficiencies that don't sound to me like they're going to be a big factor in a lot of these deals. I think there's still high cynicism about efficiencies.
How about Larry? Quick response, and then Howard.
All right. Look, efficiencies, so that it's at the front of my head. Every single merger proponent promises efficiencies. Efficiencies are easy to promise. It's tough to find out whether they are really there. And if you wait until after the merger happens, the eggs are scrambled, and it is often difficult to unscramble the eggs. I think that mergers in the tech area are going to get closer scrutiny than they have in the past. It's a stylized fact. The large tech firms, acquired hundreds of smaller tech companies over the last 15, 20 years. Despite my scenario that the Justice Department could not have stopped a Meta acquiring WhatsApp, I think there's going to be greater efforts to look closely at even small mergers, and where they think there potentially could be a problem, be prepared to go into federal district court. But we'll see.
Howard.
Yeah, I'll just add, don't have a lot to add to what's been said. I'll just on efficiencies. I do think that efficiencies really are kind of in the dumpster as a really meaningful area of defense. And the area of efficiencies that is probably the most provable can be headcount reduction. And that is just not a popular efficiency with the agencies right now, with their increased focus on labor effects, employment effects of mergers. So I don't think efficiencies are happening. One thing where I do think we'll see a difference is this. The Biden administration was eager to pursue a theory about acquiring nascent competitors. And it required a lot of sort of prognostication and sort of almost a shifting of burden about, presuming that a nascent competitor would have a better pathway and if sort of left alone and sort of a bias against those acquisitions. As the parent of a tech founder, I pray for his acquisition every day. I'm also on the cap table, so doubly pray for it. But what I would say is I don't see an appetite for pursuing those novel theories. And look, the Meta within case was one where the Biden administration took it to court. They actually got a few promising emanations in that decision, even though they lost. I don't see the Trump administration picking that up.
Okay. All right, I have a couple of questions now, and they're both sort of bigger picture, but important, and I would like us to treat this as kind of a lightning round to make sure we get through them and have time at the end for some questions. So I want to talk about, first, the FTC. A couple of you have alluded to it. President's asserted the right to fire the commissioners at will. The case is going to the Supreme Court. So 2 questions. Perhaps briefly, how is the current status of 3 Republican commissioners, no others, changing, if at all, how the FTC is operating today, if there's anything to be said about that? Perhaps more importantly, if we look down the road, it's not hard to read the tea leaves that one might think it's likely that the ability to fire the FTC commissioners at will is going to be upheld by the Supreme Court. If that happens, on the ground that the FTC is really an executive enforcement agency, what will remain of the rationale for having the FTC as a second U.S. antitrust agency? Larry, maybe you can kick
All
us
right.
off.
On the first, I can't really speak. My experience was at the Antitrust Division in the U.S. Department of Justice. The general impression of the Biden administration, FTC, is it was not a very harmonious place. Who knows what the current environment is going to end up looking like. If Humphrey's executor is reversed, overturned, this won't be the first instance where you have multiple agencies, even within the executive branch, doing overlapping things. Just think of the U.S. Department of Agriculture running the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of the Interior running the National Park Service. They're basically doing similar things. Some of the things that Interior does overlaps with some of the things that the Department of Energy does. The Federal Communications Commission is now independent. If it comes into the administration, it's going to overlap with NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Agency. This sort of thing goes on. And the other thing to remember is the FTC has a separate authorizing act and also has consumer protection responsibilities that, again, will overlap with lots of other executive branch agencies that have consumer protection.
Howard?
I think that the biggest, first of all, I think Humphreys will be overruled. I think the rationale for Humphreys or the rationale for an independent commission remains very strong, but it will be overruled on very formalist removal power constitutional grounds. And so it won't be overturned because that rationale isn't there. It'll just because they will find the structure unconstitutional. It eliminates the possibility of some cross debate. Probably the most pragmatic thing that it does is it eliminates the possibility of one of the 3 majority commissioners to become a swing vote on a certain key issue and to pull the other 2 majority commissioners over. So the FTC will be different in how it functions. In terms of having 2 separate agencies, I mean, there's a consumer protection jurisdiction, which is really valuable. we probably should have a little bit of a soul search about the structure, our dual agency structure here in the United States, because we love it. It's traditional. It's a beautiful building, has a really cool statue. But at the end of the day, we should probably think hard about our institutional structure.
So I'll make
Deb,
this
you're a DOJ person, so good riddance,
I
right?
was thinking that sometimes it's Well, so Antitrust Modernization Commission, 2007, we all recommended unanimously, I think, that there should be one. We did do that thoughtful soul searching. We did not agree on which agency. We did not agree. The people who had been at DOJ, me, would say, oh, it should be a DOJ. People who had been the FTC, Deborah Valentine, for example, no, it needs to be the FTC. There are reasons to go to one model or another. Bill Kovacic has talked, Bill Kovacic has talked extensively about how you make these institutional choices. I think that if I had to make a bet, maybe, I think 3 years from now or 2 years from now, we won't have a Federal Trade Commission, or it won't have antitrust jurisdiction. Why do I say that? Have you seen what's been happening? I mean, we're budgets and agencies and whatnot, and Larry, you may remember, during the Reagan administration, actually that was one of the projects then, was to get rid of the Federal Trade Commission. There wasn't a will in Congress to do that because that's our agency. I forgot which committee it was, and then there was a question of where do you put the consumer protection. You could just leave the consumer protection angle at the Federal Trade Commission. But I look at, hasn't the Consumer Finance Bureau, the CPFB, hasn't that basically been shut down?
Yep.
Yeah, so what's to save the FTC? I think we may end up with a single agency. I think it will be DOJ taking all of the antitrust, but we can do this in 3 years and just figure out what happened.
Right. Invite us back in 3
Right.
years.
Happy to.
So just briefly, moderator's prerogative as an FTC alum, I have felt that the FTC internal process often made it a superior decision-making body. And I think it's going to be a great loss when it seemingly has already gone away. And so I fear the FTC's days are numbered, but I'm not sure that would be a net gain for enforcement. Okay, the last question I would like to be sure we have time for, and then we'll try to get some questions from you out there in the audience. Not the elephant in the room, but Deb referred to rule of law. So the traditional, I think it's a tradition, arm's length separation between the White House and the Justice Department. Not in policy, we know that the executive branch sets policy, but in terms of individual law enforcement decisions. That traditional separation is under stress. We're seeing it primarily or most notably in cases involving prosecutions of the president's former antagonists, but we're also apparently seeing it in antitrust. And there are reports that some DOJ leaders were forced out because they resisted political involvement in specific investigations. So if we assume that that's true and it's happening, what are the implications? What are the implications for enforcement, for rule of law, for outcomes, for substantive analysis? How do you see that? And we'll just go down the line, Larry to Howard to Deb, and then we'll turn it over for questions.
Well, all right, this is nothing new. One can go back to the Nixon administration and the scandal involving the ITT Corporation and contributions and executive, high-level intervention. During the early Reagan administration, Bill Baxter, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, who led, embraced the idea that AT&T ought to be, the old AT&T Bell system ought to be broken up, and had to deal with a lot of internal politics. Department of Defense absolutely opposed. Department of Commerce absolutely opposed, and Bill kept his ground and succeeded. This administration, it's so different. I think we're going to see intervention from very high levels. And what the implications are, as I said, it's still early days.
Okay. Howard?
I mean, I think the two headline matters that have led to a lot of hand-wringing over the independence of the Antitrust Division may be fairly unique cases. That's certainly my hope, and I haven't seen any conduct at the DOJ that would suggest otherwise. So I think, for 99% of cases, there will be regular order. We do have a president with an unusually strong unitary view of the executive power, and I expect that to be manifest over all aspects of the executive branch. I think, as Larry has pointed out, that this isn't the first time in history that that's happened. I will just hope that the excellent staff at the DOJ continue to make their decisions based on the analysis and the merit in the law.
Right, and I'll add that my hair is not on fire about this. I mean, I really do believe in the rule of law and the perceptions, and really strongly. Amex, CWT, that was brought in the very end of the Biden administration. The UK CMA, which has been fairly aggressive, had ultimately concluded, based on their understanding of the facts, that there wasn't a case. They didn't oppose it. It seems possible to me, likely that the new people who were looking at the facts at the time, and Trump too, made a similar decision. So I'm not willing to say that this is corruption, or anything. HP Juniper, but for Roger Alford's statement, which I don't want to dismiss, that case, when it was brought, I don't know if people remember, people were saying that seems like a pretty aggressive case, because the companies had combined less than a 30% share. Now, the allegation was that there would be a duopoly because Cisco was the giant in the room. So that was unusual. They did have a remedy. Apparently, there was an issue of national security. Okay, and then just from what I've read, the national security idea was that, look, it's important for the U.S. to have a fighting position against China and Huawei and AI and all that, and so we really need to have this transaction provide us a second strong competitor as opposed to two weaker ones. Okay, now you could disagree as a policy matter whether that should be a basis for challenging or not challenging, or accepting or not accepting remedies. You could disagree about whether this is going down a national champion route, et cetera, et cetera. And those policy disagreements have occurred and will occur. In my view, it's not a hair on fire moment if all that happened is that the folks on the 5th floor in the Attorney General's office and maybe different parts of the Trump administration weighed in on that decision. Roger's statement, we'll probably see more about it. He doesn't say there was bribery or anything. He doesn't really, he intimates things, but when I read it, I just can't tell, frankly, whether he's actually talking about corruption or whether he just felt like people who didn't know enough and were making different choices were calling it. So I'm not ready to, but I do think that there's a perception problem that would be useful for the administration to make clear, that may be more easily done after the court rules through the Tony Act proceeding on that. So, and I agree, Larry, of course, people, and even after you were gone, and then we actually did the '84 merger guidelines. I was involved in that. One of the reasons was because the whole government, the Commerce and other parts of the agency, were very concerned about the direction of our antitrust policy. If you remember back then, the issue was, our infrastructure industry, steel, et cetera, the more efficient mini mills in Japan and Germany, and there was a real question back at the time, if people think back to the economic situation, about whether our antitrust policies were bad for our economy. And it was, and so antitrust enforcers have a pretty narrow view of things. And back then, it was even more narrow because it was really price effects, pretty much. And, but there are other ramifications for the economy and for our economic well-being, for national security, that, in my view, sometimes should weigh on the ultimate decision. And after all, the Antitrust Division is a part of the Department of Justice, so if the Attorney General weighs in on a matter, I mean, again, that to me is not inappropriate. So.
Good. Yeah, and just to clarify, the question really wasn't asking about corruption, although if there's corruption, you want to know, but more at what level sort of routine day-to-day decisions are made. Howard sort of suggested maybe it's 99% on the merits, if you will, by the experts. If that's where we are, one might say that's probably not a bad place place to be, and probably not that far out of the mainstream from where things have been before.
Look at the FTC on some of the national defense mergers, for
Right.
example.
But is it? But maybe we'll convene again and ask, is it 99%? You know, that might be a good place to be if that's where we are. Okay, so I think let's just, we're past 1 o'clock, but I think we have a little flexibility to open it up for a question or two.
I think so.
While folks are still online. So your chance to ask questions of the
And
panelists.
again, I'll ask you to just simply identify yourself and your organization. If you've got a question, love to hear from you. As I said, we've got plenty of expertise in the room. Time for questions, then we'll convene the informal part of this after questions.
And make it a question,
and-
not a statement.
All right, John, you're the host.
All right, I'll take point. Olga. It's coming your way.
Microphone?
Well, thank you so much. Very interesting panel. Maybe could you briefly talk about this labor angle in the merger review? Have you seen it coming up, more frequently? Maybe you have thoughts about what kind of cases are more prone to this theories of harm.
Sure. That's what an economist would call monopsony power, the power of a buyer to push down the price of an input that is buying, often labor. This is an area that economists have known about for over a century, but it wasn't central to our thinking. It just wasn't. The amount of time that any economics course spends on monopsony is like this amount as compared with monopoly, this amount. I think we're going to see more of it, and I think this administration is going to pursue labor-oriented cases, whether it is in a merger context or a monopolization context. There's a developing body of economics literature that is starting to support the idea there really can be monopsony power exercised. So I think we're going, again, and it will fit one of the populist perspectives.
If you'll excuse, I'll play panelist for just one moment in Howard's absence. I think I would look at the Kroger-Albertsons merger that happened last year. The FTC was pushing a case of driving down labor costs as harmful.
Unionized labor.
Correct, and the judge ultimately did not agree with that. Ironically, that would have turned a cost efficiency into a harm, and the case didn't go forward, but there still may be some appetite for it. Other questions? Philippe.
Thank you for a fascinating panel. I wanted to connect Deborah's question with this question and ask a more big picture question. So one of the statistics we're seeing now is that like 10% of households in the US are responsible for 50% of consumption, right? And one of the reasons why this is the case, well, the sole reasons like average salaries have been stagnated since basically the mid-1970s or something like that. So do you think that this is a problem for antitrust, yes or no? And if it is a problem, how should it impact antitrust enforcement? Since you're talking about politics, populism, economics, I'd love to hear your views on the panel on this question.
I mean, I think there are some places antitrust, there are problems that are important problems and issues to deal with. I'm not sure antitrust is the right tool. I testified back at the time of after 2008, the banking crisis. And it was all about what can antitrust do? And I was on a panel with a bunch of progressives on it. And we all agreed. We all agreed that important issues, antitrust is not the right tool because of, if I'm understanding your question, I mean, because really, antitrust is good at looking at price effects, for example, and other theories of merger harm. I don't think it can solve every problem. That was one of the things that the Biden administration in particular was investigating. Can we use antitrust? I call it social engineering, but how can we go outside the box and use antitrust for all these? There may be, maybe I'm not imagining enough ways in which antitrust could effectively be used, but in my view, it's better to make different policy choices and decisions that aren't using the law enforcement tools of the antitrusters.
I mean, I think that there's a tendency when you have a hammer to see everything being a nail, and that's what Lina Khan and the FTC did. But I have a little bit of sympathy for it. Things like wealth distribution, wage stagnation, things like that are the province of different policy tools, or more, could be the province of different policy tools. Better fiscal policy, a different tax system, different kinds of wage and hour policies and labor requirements. When you're not getting those, you look at the levers that you do have. And to the extent that corporate consolidation, monopoly power, technology, tilting the balance in favor of those who are purchasers of labor because of productive efficiencies leading to less need for labor, you start to think hard about, well, we have no control over those other tools. The legislature may not be exercising them in a way that's effective. Let's use what we can. And so, I have some sympathy there. What I really think, where I think the rhetoric has greatly outstripped reality and the economics, is in how effective those tools really can be in righting the balance of wealth distribution and dealing with wage stagnation. I think that the coefficient on the antitrust as a tool is very low. And you want to be careful about overemphasizing those tools or over-broadening to the point that they can't achieve actually their core purposes. So yes, let's use antitrust where we can, but let's be modest and realistic about what it can achieve.
And let me just add, I agree with everything that both Deb and Howard have said. And this is a broader issue. Think back 5, 6 years ago, a lot of concern about data privacy and the big companies, and oh geez, maybe antitrust can do something about this. No, it really can't. Antitrust ought to be focused on the market power issues that it is best suited to address.
I think we've got time for one more question in the back.
Hi, I'm Joe, a 1L at the Law Center. There's a little bit of an inconsistency I sense from some things that have been said between what you see as this administration's strict restructuring or focus on large tech companies, and what I would say is this administration's also relationship with some of these tech people like Zuckerberg, for example. Do you see that there being a collision course between, as you say, this kind of strict regulatory sense and the president's developing personal relationships with some of these tech people?
Oh man, idiosyncratic. It's where I started.
But can I just add to that, because it's a great question. And I think one or two of you mentioned remedies. Is that where the rubber meets the road? These cases are going forward. Maybe there'll be more, but how are they going to get resolved at the end?
Look, I think it is a great question, Joe. And I don't see a contradiction there. And let me explain why. First of all, it's always been the case that leaders of industry have had close connections with political leaders. This happens to be a president that particularly relishes those. But I'll make 2 points. One is, I'm not sure it's done them a whole lot of good.
Yeah, really.
If you look at the tech titans who've gone to the White House and had dinner with President Trump and tried to get
Showed
something
up
out
at
of
the
it.
inauguration.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's getting them much. But I'll also say something else. We're in a sort of remarkable moment when a lot of the things that used to be very influenced by government policy are being disintermediated by these large tech platforms that operate in many ways outside traditional forms of industrial regulation, outside the policies of the FCC, and who have tremendous influence. And in some sense, if you're a political leader and you're concerned about how preferences are being formed, the health and well-being of minors online, you have limited policy tools. You want to use, persuasion and the power of your office, because the people who really have power over these things now are, Sundar Pichai and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman, and we could go down a very long list of these people. So query whether it's a good or bad thing in terms of having some influence and insight into what's going on, that these relationships are occurring. There is a potential downside, and I think it's exactly what Mark said. It's that at some point you'll go easy on them in return for something, and remedies may be where that hits the road. So it's a great question. I would say watch this space. I'm not alarmed by it, but we should be vigilant.
Yeah, I agree with your point on the soft power kind of stuff. And actually, historically, different presidents have used that with the titans in industry to achieve things. So I don't.
right.
So
That's right.
I can see why you have the concern, but again, it's for me, it's keep calm and carry on and let's see. Because at this point, I don't think that we're necessarily. And this is something that I would put in kind of the bucket of corruption, but I don't think we're there at this point.
So let me just say thank you very, very much for your patience as we ran over a little bit. We're through with a formal Q&A session, but the good news is for those of you who are here in the audience, there is a lovely lunch back there. If you haven't had an opportunity to have some lunch, please make yourselves welcome to it. Feel free to interact with the panelists and the moderators, and please help me thank the panelists.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Good to see you again. Good to meet you.
Thanks so much.
Always a treat.
I'm going to be waiting for that
And
text.
that book is coming.
Okay.